on a cost-to-benefit analysis, whether it was killing al-Baghdadi or Soleimani or the Wagner Group or bombing ISIS in his first term or hitting the nuclear facilities in his second in Iran or the Maduro kidnapping, capture, etc. And so that's a good way to look at it. What are the downsides? The downside is if he starts bombing, who does he bomb? And can he hit them? He has to have the revolutionary groups, guards. He has to get the theocracy. They all know he's going to be after them. They're in bunkers. Will he be able to do it? He's going to have to get their missile depots. He's going to have to get all of the means of that regime exercises to create deterrence. Missiles, nuclear facilities he missed, tanks, get rid of them all. And he should expect, as we saw with Hamas in the tunnel, that they'll all be parked, stored like they are in Beirut, in apartment buildings, in hospitals, in mosques. And so they want a lot of collateral damage. And then he has to understand that he needs a popular uprising at the same time. We've already had one. And that prompted him to send the assets to the region. But he said, and you said, 32,000 people were killed. And they're probably executing thousands that we don't even know about. So if you're afraid to go out on the street and you see American planes, maybe even Israeli planes, and they're hitting targets, is your reaction, good, I'm glad they're killing my government? Or, well, I don't really care anymore, they've killed us. Why are they hurting Iran? I'm an Iranian. And will that create a counter-patriotic fervor? Then he has to think, look what happened in Libya when we bombed. We got rid of Gaddafi, the Obama, that triad of Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton, and Samantha Power. And what did they give us? They gave us ultimate chaos. And we went in and took out Saddam, we had chaos. We went in and got rid of the Taliban, we got chaos. And we had to stay there. So do we want ground troops in there to No, we don't. So who is going to take the place? The Shah? And if we could get the Shah's son, we could have him say, I will not be in power for more than 3 years. I'm a transitional to get a new constitution and bring in outside observers for fair elections. And we're going to outlaw that theocratic Khomeini party, sort of like the Germans outlaw the Nazi party. So that's a lot of, and then he has the weather, and then he has other considerations. Israel has a whole list of targets, and they may not be the same number of targets as we are. They have killers that have killed Jews. They have terrorists. They know where they are. Once people see Israeli planes, does that confirm the propaganda of the regime that it's Israelis, etc.? Then he's got the MAGA base to worry about. Tucker Carlson said just the 30-minute incursion into Iran was going to start World War III. Steve Bannon, that group. And so he has the assets. You can't take a 100,000 displacement, 100,000 ton displacement, huge carrier, $14 billion, 5,000 people, and just stick it out there forever. You know what I mean? It has a shelf life, maybe 3-4 months at most. So he's assembling these assets, and they're almost in place. They're in the Mediterranean, they're in the Gulf of Hormuz, they're in the Persian Gulf, they're in the Red Sea. They can come at a 360-degree angle, but they're reaching their climatic point, and they're at extreme readiness. That means if you're a young sailor, you're not sleeping well, you're going to be called at any moment, you're having drill, you're at a state of readiness that's not sustainable for more than 3 or 4 weeks. So at some point, the commanders are going to come to Trump and say, you've got to pull the trigger or we got to go back. And that is going to be a decision, I think, that has political ramifications. So then his other advisors are going to say, we're 9 months from the midterm. If you're going to do it, you got to do it now. And this is what can happen if we have a bloodbath and we hit a hospital, and the Europeans, don't expect the Europeans to be there. Don't expect the British to let us use Diego Garcia. Don't expect anybody, and expect the Chinese and the Russians to be very angry because they're going to lose their asset and they will cause us problems somewhere else. Maybe they'll start threatening at a higher degree Taiwan, or maybe Putin will escalate in Ukraine while we're doing this. So there's all these things that he has to filter out as important, somewhat important, irrelevant. And then he has to say, what is the timing on the world stage? Well, the Olympics is over. You can't bomb somebody during the Olympics. I mean, there's this pretense.
All these things come in, that's true.
And you can't bomb somebody before the State of the Union. So my anticipation is the Olympics are over. The State of the Union is over. The weather and the seasons are getting better. And if he is going to do it, he would probably do it in the next 10 days. Trump pretty much was accurate when he said those who suffer large deficits, $300 billion deficits, are in a much better position in negotiations than those that pile them up. Trump is very astute in his own way. He wanted to restore global and domestic confidence in the military, but the one way not to do it would have like a Carter rescue mission or a commando raid. These are a fraud. And he had noticed that the last day in office that Obama was president, I think it has had that effect. I think it's had a profound effect on Europe. So the subsequent NATO alliance summit was very different than the 2017, just to take one example, the first administration. They were calling Trump, the supreme NATO leader was calling him daddy, but more importantly, there was no opposition except for Spain to the idea that Europe would, eventually try to get 5% of GDP investment in defense, that Germany would have the biggest land army they promised in Europe. Poland has already spent almost over 4% GDP. There was no criticism. It was almost a triumphant presence or intercession by Trump, and that's because I think they saw that they had played a two-sided, two-faced, I should say, attitude toward Iran. They were deathly afraid of that nuclear program, and coupled with ballistic missiles that put them in greater danger than even us, because they were so more proximate. And more importantly, it was up against their idea of preemptive action. So they wanted it out, but they couldn't do it themselves, and they wanted the United States to do it, or Israel, and they wanted to be able to criticize that. And I think with Trump, they realized that they could not criticize him, or he wouldn't stand for it. So then they decided, well, just as Israel had been empowered and there were no threats to cut off munitions as Biden had done, there was no daylight anymore between Israel, maybe a closer relationship with the United States, now that we have somebody who's not afraid to protect its interest, and those interests include NATO, maybe we should move closer to the United States, because it's sounding a different tune now. It's confident, and with the Ukrainian mess right next door, we get the impression that the United States has got a greater deterrent ability to stop Putin's aggression. And so it had a lot of ripples effect, and that's not the only one. It also warned China. I think I wrote about that everybody had said China's might intervene. Well, China just basically came over and said, keep the Straits of Hormuz open. That's it. We get 50% of our oil from the Middle East. Do not close the strait. Putin was asked, are you going to replace the Iranian anti-aircraft missile? And his basic attitude was no. And the subtext was, why would I do it again when you would lose it? And I've got enough problems with Ukraine without getting mired in Iran with you people. And you're losers, you lost. You're like the Assads, you're an embarrassment. So I don't want any part of you. Basically, they had China, that was kind of striking, because we heard from the right here in America that it would be World War III, 30,000 casualties, a forever war, and that could only happen if China and Russia had intervened. We were warned that the BRICS new alliance would be deadly for us, but it turned out that in some weird, perverse way, after Iran was humiliated, its subordinates and its allies hated it as much as we hated it. When Trump, when he took out Soleimani, he actually was asking people, is there any credibility to this fearsome reputation? And the only real conventional example was the 80-88 war, in which, Iraq had about 40% of the population and fought it to a standstill for 8 years and forced Khomeini to sue for peace. So I think Trump thought before the Israeli attrition of Iran, but even more so afterwards, that Iran was not a formidable power. contrary to everything that we read about in the United States. There was just something in the last 50 years about these goose-stepping Nazi-like soldiers, the screaming death to America, that had a profound impression on Westerners, but it was never calibrated on actual reality of military competency or efficacy. And the Israelis knew that. They were not afraid to attack them, and they understood that they were, that their Air Force was just, they weren't even comparable. I think all of the major players, or I should say the antagonists in this theater, had gotten the mistaken impression from the Biden administration that the United States was weak and it couldn't act. And there was some evidence that for that supposition, as misguided ultimately as it proved. The Chinese, for example, they had humiliated our diplomats in Anchorage right at the beginning of the Biden. They had allowed they had allowed a spy balloon to go with impunity across the continental United States. They were buying farmland over the objection of people in Congress in proximity to bases, and we did nothing. They were running up these huge trade deficits. They were known 2 or 3% of the 300,000 students were engaged in espionage. Everybody knew that. We had a PLA person on the faculty at Stanford. Nobody acted on it. And China took that not as magnanimity to be reciprocated, but as weakness to be exploited. And then when you looked at the Arab Middle East, counterintuitively, the Gulf sheikdoms in Jordan and Egypt, they looked at this and they said well, if the Biden administration is having daylight between Israel and it's reacting to domestic pressure, why would we want to get on the Abraham's Accord when they're kind of distancing themselves from Israel and they're reacting to pro-Hamas demonstrations in their own party base that are more pro-Palestinian than we are? And the Gulf Sheikdom said, we're looking right across the Gulf at Iran, and this Biden administration is giving them money, lifting them sanctions. We were down 45,000 recruits that would not join the military. And the DI was in commercials on television. So in their way of thinking, the U.S. military, humiliated in Afghanistan, fraught with recruitment shortments, and turning into a social justice network, has lost its edge. And that is reified by its diplomatic cautiousness and appeasement because it doesn't feel that its military could back up any diplomatic initiatives. And that was and it was added to it by the dementia of Joe Biden, and not just the dementia, but the empty bombast. What would you say to Putin? Don't. He would say things like that. And it was completely empty, and so it was a force multiplier. I think a lot of us were very worried in 2024, 23, that things were spiraling out of control, and somebody was going to do something stupid, whether that was invasion of Taiwan or Iran preempting against Israel. And it was a very dangerous time. Trump is very astute in his own way. He wanted to restore global and domestic confidence in the military, but the one way not to do it would have like a Carter rescue mission or a commando raid. These are a fraud. And he had noticed that the last day in office that Obama was president, for all of the Democrats talk about the War Powers Act, he bombed pretty much 26,000 bombs he dropped in 2016. But the point I'm making is that he ordered the same B-2s on a long mission of 5,000 miles to bomb a Libyan terrorist camp successfully, and they came back. And Trump realized that if you're going to use U.S. power and you're going to intimidate the enemy and actually in real terms hurt it, the best thing that you can do is air power. We kind of discounted that in the past because we were reacting against the Bill Clinton missiles to kill a camel and all that rhetoric. And we've got to get on the ground because we were going to nation build and change the very calculus of these countries so that we were going to the root causes. Well, that didn't work out, again, in a cost-benefit analysis. So Trump said, what is our forte? And what are the least chances it can go wrong? And what are the most impressive uses of it? And so when you have these huge bombers with 170-foot wingspan, and they go all across, halfway across the world, and they drop these huge bombs that no one else has into something about the size of a dryer or a washer, it's very impressive. It means that the United States now is very selective in its allies and subordinates, and they're very accomplished. So they look at Israel and they can't quite calibrate how a country of 9.5 million people is dominating the entire region and dominated in every type of conventional, non-conventional terrorist aspects, especially its intelligence. The idea that anybody in Hamas or Hezbollah or in the Iranian nuclear physics community or the command and control would come up and privately say, I'm going to destroy Israel, that's synonymous with them getting killed. And they know that. And no other country can do that. So the United States has an ally like that. Even when they look at Ukraine, they say, for all of the MAGA disputes about Ukraine, here's a country with 40 million people. It has 1/4 the population, 1/10 the GDP, 1/30th the area, and it's held off this juggernaut. And we're supplying it. And Trump is starting to see that now, that if he cuts it off, it's like a Kabul, but if he keeps funding it, maybe they can he'll have the leverage to get a ceasefire. Then they look at NATO and they said, the NATO acquisitions that Trump had been pushing and supported, it's not Latvia, it's the greatest artillery force in Europe, the Finns, and it's Sweden with probably the most sophisticated arms industry, especially fighter aircraft. So these are real assets that are coming into NATO while it bolsters its military expenditures. It's got in the Middle East an ally fighting for its life that wants to fight and will be successful, Israel. It's got another one with Russia in Ukraine, and people are saying in Asia that had doubt under the Biden. I'm talking about South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines. They're saying, we feel a lot more secure as long as we understand that Trump helps those who helps themselves. So he's a blunderbuss when he berates people that don't like. They're watching what he says to Canada. Well, he's screaming and yelling at Canada because they spend 1.37 on GDP. But if you were to spend what Trump wanted and you were to be pro-American, then he will be reciprocal and he will help his allies. He helps those who help themselves. And the result of that on China and Russia, I think right now they're in a holding pattern. Both of them are. They're kind of mystified in a very strange way.